Understanding USAID's policy framework. Really pleased to see all of you here today, both in person and online. I'm Tony Pippa. I'm a senior fellow in the Center for Sustainable Development here at the Brookings Institution. And a warm welcome just for what I'm sure will be a rich conversation today about USAID's policy framework. Those of us who are here at the Center for Sustainable Development are really pleased to host this conversation. And I'm especially pleased to welcome our guests from USAID. Those will be participating in today's conversation, and those of you who are here in the audience and online. And it's great to see old friends, but before we get too far into the program, I just want to start by offering my congratulations, actually, to our guests. I know from firsthand experience how complex and how tricky it is to produce a policy framework for the agency, having been part of producing a framework in a previous administration. It has to balance many different things, and it has to be informed by many different things, including the experiences of USAID programming that's come before it, by evidence about what's working, what's not, by analysis of the important global trends and where the world's going, and the role of international development in it, and by the role of the U.S. and in particular the agency, and the role that the agency can play in providing leadership and investment that matters, leadership and investment that maximizes development impact while also advancing the interests of our country. So, comes with a lot of responsibility. The document provides the roadmap and the guidance for everyone who works at the agency across so many different parts of the world. But it's also important for helping others within the U.S. government understand USAID's role in helping advance the objectives of the National Security Strategy and its perspective on the National Security Council. It helps implementers of the agency's programs understand the goals and objectives that the agency has in mind, the rationale behind them, and it lays out the agency's priorities for its partner countries and spells out how it's going to contribute to their aspirations and to the globe as a whole on agreements like the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Climate Accords. So, no small task, especially given that the U.S. remains the world's largest bilateral donor. So really, a warm and hearty congratulations on producing this particular policy framework, and really looking forward to today's conversation. For today's program, we're going to start by hearing from Ambassador Isabel Coleman, who's the Deputy Administrator at USAID. She will kick us off with some opening remarks, give us a broad outline of the policy framework, the priorities it elevates and why. And that's going to set the stage for a panel discussion co-moderated by my colleague here at the Center for Sustainable Development, George Ingram, and Susan Reichley, who was my first boss at USAID, now at the International Youth Foundation, as they discuss the framework with Michelle Similis and Sarah Rose, and engage with questions and comments from you in the audience as we get underway on that discussion. So to get started, it's my pleasure to introduce Ambassador Isabel Coleman, who's USAID's Deputy Administrator for Policy and Programming. In that role, she oversees the agency's regional and pillar bureaus and guides USAID's crisis response, including on the National Security Council. This role means that she's responsible for overseeing agency efforts to promote food security, strengthen education, health, democracy, and economic growth. And her work builds on more than 25 years' worth of experience working in government, the private sector, and nonprofits. Immediately prior to coming to USAID, she served as Chief Operating Officer of Give Directly, and before that, she was at the U.S. mission to the UN and served as the UN Ambassador to the United Nations for Management, Reform, and Special Political Affairs, where I had the good fortune of working directly with her during my time at the U.S. mission. So, please welcome me in welcoming Ambassador Isabel Coleman.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us here today. It's really a pleasure to be able to launch our policy framework with all of you here this afternoon. And thank you, Tony, for that great opening and reminder of why all of the work that we put into something like a policy framework is so important because it does really signal intent and priorities to so many different constituencies. So thank you for that, and thank you for all your great collaboration over the years. And thank you to George, who I know is going to moderate our panel discussion after this. And George, who is also no stranger to USAID, having served as our Principal Deputy Assistant Administrator for our Europe and Eurasia Bureau during the early years of former Soviet states where, believe it or not, today I'm spending quite a bit of my time. So, for decades, Brookings has hosted important policy discussions like this. And I'm so happy that some of my colleagues are here to have the conversation this afternoon. Michelle Similis, who heads our Bureau for Policy Planning and Learning, and Michelle really took a lead on this policy framework, so thank you, Michelle. Sarah Rose, who's our Senior Advisor for Localization, and Susan Reichley, who is also a longtime USAID person and a former counselor for USAID, and now the president and CEO of the International Youth Foundation. So you're going to have a great discussion with all of them. Brookings' thought leadership over the decades has been really critical on the issues and challenges in international development and has really helped USAID and the US government evaluate progress and develop strategies to strengthen our mission as stewards of democracy and defenders of human dignity around the world. It's fair to say that the document we're discussing today, our policy framework, has in one way or another been informed and strengthened by the expertise here at Brookings. A Brookings report issued last month titled "The Second Half of the Sustainable Development Goals Era, Ideas for Doing Things Differently," reaches important conclusions about a central dilemma that faces all of us, that the world has not been doing enough differently to be on course for SDG success. Despite the incredible progress that's been made over the last few decades in reducing extreme poverty, addressing hunger and malnutrition, boosting lifespans, cutting maternal and child mortality, fueling democracy's rise, getting kids in school, spurring economic development and growth, we are now seeing reversals to many of these gains. From day one of this administration, USAID has been very clear-eyed about the scope of today's challenges. We know that COVID-19 decimated health systems, leading to resurgence in diseases from measles to tuberculosis, and to the first global decline in life expectancy in decades. We also see the devastating effects of the pandemic on the global economy and many, many nations' finances. After a decade of heavy borrowing and more recently rising inflation, we are now increasingly concerned about the roughly 60% of the world's poorest countries facing debt distress. Moreover, natural disasters are increasing in frequency and intensity, leading to a sharp rise in humanitarian needs. And democracy continues to face threats from all sides, as authoritarian regimes engage in transnational corruption, repress civil society, and spread disinformation, all to undermine freedom and consolidate power. These are incredibly daunting challenges, to be sure, and beyond our own capacity to solve, especially if we just rely on traditional strategies for development and growth. Frankly, we don't have a choice but to do development differently than it's been done in the past. And that's the spirit of USAID's new policy framework, which we've called Driving Progress Beyond Programs. It's a document that outlines today's development challenges and brings them into focus under a series of 5 agency priorities. It brings together the interrelated components of our ambitious reform agenda, and it guides us to use our expertise, our convening power, and advocacy to draw in more partners, leverage more resources, spark new innovations, and inspire broader movements for change. The first priority, the long-standing need, for which is made urgent once again by the crisis in Sudan, is to better link our humanitarian assistance and recovery to our long-term development work. When armed conflict ensnares innocent civilians, whether in the Sahel and Ukraine or even here in our own hemisphere, more coordinated efforts in peace, resilience, and basic needs like food security will help foster more sustainable results. The second priority is to support partner countries to mitigate and adapt to climate change by leading partnerships and initiatives that reduce global emissions and expand access to climate mitigation finance. USAID's partners around the world are calling on us now more than ever to scale the impact of our climate assistance, including through the Just Energy Transition Partnership, the President's plan to conserve global forests, and Power Africa. Through PREPARE, the President's Emergency Plan for Adaptation and Resilience, we will also do our part to make sure the U.S. meets its goal of helping more than 500 million people in developing countries adapt to and manage the impacts of climate change by 2030. The third priority is in countries where democratic reformers are pushing for change, so-called bright spots. We will rally to help democracies deliver concrete development results for their citizens. We will not only provide investment in governance, anti-corruption, media freedom, and the rule of law, but we will also marshal additional resources to support near-term economic dividends and quality of life improvements. We will be nimble when democratic openings arise, mobilizing rapid support that is responsive to emerging local needs. Our fourth priority is to respond to the stresses felt in the health sector. We will go beyond USAID's flagship disease programs to expand our impact and investments in the primary healthcare systems. We will improve integration across global health programming, including in digital health, and invest in a stronger primary health workforce and community health workers capable of adapting to shifting needs and working towards universal health coverage. And the fifth agency priority is to help countries address the grueling economic headwinds that so many are facing in order to help them get back on a path of inclusive economic growth. Each of these priorities, of course, shares causes and effects with one or more, so some of the traditional siloed approaches we've taken in the past will need to be reinvigorated. The framework pushes us to build our existing efforts to make our work more effective. We're experimenting and rigorously evaluating our work, including through methods like cash benchmarking, where pioneering studies by USAID found wide-ranging economic benefits of direct cash transfers. While we have extensive experience using cash in humanitarian settings, we're now seeing its value in development contexts as well. In Rwanda, for example, cash benchmarking of a 5-year workforce readiness program delivered results beyond the program's core business outcomes to include improvements in consumption, income, and wealth. With this type of experimentation and evaluation, we are honing our tools for cash and non-cash programming alike, allowing us to invest in approaches that have the highest impact. Across USAID programming and deep within its development toolkit, we have hard-won expertise to bring to bear, to make the most of our investments. But just because we're growing our impact does not mean we can achieve sustainable results alone. Here we are guided by the second part of the policy framework, which highlights the importance of new partnerships in responding to today's challenges. The first line of effort to expand our partnerships is a renewed commitment to development diplomacy. Through our convening power, our standing in multilateral institutions, our influence as a global power, and our considerable budget, we will drive collective action to solve shared challenges both globally and at the country level. Next is deeper engagement with the private sector. Here, too, is a path to achieving progress beyond the constraints of our budgets. For example, in October of last year, USAID launched Agri-Ukraine to bolster Ukrainian agricultural production and exports to help alleviate the global food security crisis exacerbated by Russia's war. Earlier this year, we joined forces with Bayer, encouraging them to invest more than $35 million to boost the capacity of the company's seed processing facility in Ukraine as part of its collaboration with our Agri-Ukraine initiative. Private sector buy-in is crucial and also underscores the reach of our development diplomacy. And through an ambitious strategy to boost locally led development, we are putting more local actors at the helm, since they're the ones who know best how to drive effective change in their communities and sustain that change over the long term. This localization effort is not exactly new. Many administrations have worked towards locally led development goals in the past and have fallen short. So we're not under any illusions about how hard this is going to be. But we're making real, tangible progress by institutionalizing new ways to interact with the agency, by simplifying our registration and awards processes, by adjusting our appetite for risk, and by setting forth a new strategy for the grant and contract award process that initiates the tools, the cultural shifts, and actionable steps needed to bring about our ambitious localization initiatives. Last year, we obligated 10.2% of our funding to local partners, up from 7.4% in fiscal year 2021. In dollar terms, we obligated $600 million more to local partners in fiscal year 2022 than in fiscal year 21, a 66% increase. That is significant progress, and it's progress we can build on. Finally, and critically, the policy framework focuses on empowering and supporting our workforce as an investment in our impact and our effectiveness as an organization. By reducing burdens that needlessly trap staff behind desks and piles of paperwork, instead of directly engaging them with partners. By growing and investing in the workforce so they have the support they need to do the job they love without burning out. By informing our work with the latest development thinking and data, making it easier for staff to wield rigorous evidence, make informed decisions, and hone our tools for development impact to take those lessons forward. By prioritizing diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, and reforming aspects of our recruitment and retention strategies that have traditionally sidelined underrepresented voices and limited our potential as a development partner. And the framework underscores our commitment to making long-awaited investments in all parts of our workforce, including our local staff, without whom none of our long-term development goals would be possible. Confronting today's biggest development challenges, forcing and embracing new partnerships, and investing in USAID's strongest assets, its people. This is how we are going to be able to achieve progress beyond the scope of our budgets and our programs. Taken as a whole, USAID's new policy framework is about a shift in our mindset, recognizing that we are problem solvers first and foremost, rather than simply assistance programmers. And it's an encapsulation of our values, our ambition, and our ability to put those values to work in pursuit of a world that affords dignity for all. I hope you've had a chance to look at the policy framework and that you'll feel free to share your feedback with us. And as I said at the top, for years, so many of you online and in this room have really helped to lay the foundation for the work that is reflected in this policy framework and this vision. So thank you all again.
For those of you who are young research assistants here or elsewhere and are looking for a career model, I learned before we came up here that Paloma's first job in Washington was a pre-doctorate research assistant here at Brookings. So nice career path.
Isabel.
Thank you. My thanks to Tony and to Isabel for laying the framework today. We're going to have a moderated conversation for about 45 minutes and then invite you to engage in the conversation. You've already been introduced to the panel. I'm George Ingram here at Brookings. Michelle brings a very diverse experience in the civil society, on the Hill, a prior engagement at AID, to what I think is sort of the Brookings of AID, the think tank. And in a few months, she not only will be head of the Policy Bureau, but head of Policy and Budget, which is very exciting for those of us who go back to the days when those two functions were in the same office. Sarah Rose, I know very well from her time before AID with the Center for Global Development and the Modernizing Foreign Assistance Network, where she was a real thought leader on development effectiveness, and I'm sure that her colleagues at AID are very pleased to have her there. Susan Reichley, who had a 25-year career at AID, including as Council and Mission Director, recreated the office that Michelle is now head of, and her knowledge of policy development is so deep. I've asked her to share the role with me of the moderator. So she's playing a dual role of both panelist and moderator. And we're not going to worry exactly at what time she plays which role.
Good to know, George.
But let's start off, Michelle, at a broad level, at the big picture. And two aspects of that. One is, I think we all got a little self-satisfied in the immediate post-Cold War era, in which development appeared to be on the ascendancy in how it engaged in global development. That got cut short with 9/11, and even more so now with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and with the global challenge of China. So that development is now having to struggle for being heard, for being valued in considerations of foreign policy and security. Secondly, I think it's notable that this framework, that the subtext of it is progress beyond programs, and that there's discussion in there of new partnerships and elevating the practice of development diplomacy. And I know aid forever has been more than just about the dollars. But what does this subtext, this theme of the policy framework imply for USAID on how it functions? And how do you maneuver in this context where security and foreign policy issues seem to be at the forefront?
Well, thanks, George, very much for hosting us here today. And I have to admit, it is a bit intimidating to be on the stage with people who've held my role in the past, as well as people who've been thinking about these issues for a very long time. So I just want to say thank you to all of you who've been my mentors over the years and for coming here today. I also just want to recognize my colleagues from USAID who were here today, specifically Josh Kaufman, Aaron Roche, Julie Lelick, Kim Boswick, many people in PPL who really were the heart and soul of this effort, as well as many of our colleagues in the front office who really made this all come together. We have been working on the policy framework with the administrator for about a year now, and this really is an articulation of what she believes. So let me just take a little bit of a stab at your question, and then others can ask further questions later. First of all, I would say that what the policy framework tries to really demonstrate is that development is actually more important than ever in this environment that you're talking about. We at USAID are often seen as the affirmative side of what the U.S. has to offer to a lot of our partners around the world, whether it is the challenge of the PRC, whether it is issues around the Wagner Group in Africa, but we are providing resources that are telling a story different from what many of those who have a different world order are providing. So I think we are very excited to be, as you all know, part of the National Security Council with our administrator being on that panel. We're very excited to be at the table. We're very excited to be able to say, you know, there can be other options, other ways of working. We can do things like say you cannot use Huawei, as Congress has said to us in our bill, but we are then going to countries and saying, well, let's talk about your digital transformation. Let's talk about what you can do. Let's give you the skills to do that. And so we are very, this tries to lay that out. It tries to lay out our priorities. And later we'll talk about inclusive economic growth, which is a new priority that's laid out here. And that really is about saying to countries, how can you leapfrog? How can you become the next manufacturing hub of Africa? What kind of an enabling environment do you need? What kind of skills do you need to be able to do that? We're doing a lot of work on many, many of those issues. In terms of how we're acting and being different, I just want to say, a lot of my foreign service colleagues will say, we've been doing this all the time. This is what we do at Post all the time. And actually, Susan and I were recently talking about the 20-year transformation in Colombia and how people laid out a pathway to get there. And what this policy framework, though, is trying to say to people is make this more important than it usually is. Mm-hmm. We get so focused on implementing programs. What are the outcomes? How do we design this? How does that happen? We still need to do that. But when you design that program, how do you do it in a new way? What kind of new questions do you ask? You're not just doing an agriculture program in a rural part of Africa. You're saying, how does this agriculture program add to the economic growth capacity in this country? Mm-hmm. How do we reach new and different populations, whether it's women, whether it's young people, and trying to give them new skills? So what this is trying to do is say, let's think about those questions. They're just as important as how your program's going to work. And then finally, what it's also about is bringing new partners to the table. It's about bringing the private sector and understanding that if you're going to have the private sector come in, there's going to be, it has to be about benefits to them as a company, as an organization, but also how do you help them benefit the people that they're serving in the community they're in? How do you bring philanthropy to the table? We are currently working on 3 new MOUs with 3 different foundations to work on new different parts of the localization agenda. How do you work with donor partners in new and different ways? And this is how we're working differently within USAID. So just recently, the president went to Ireland. And as part of that, he talked about what Irish Aid is doing on global food security. That is work that we have been doing with Irish Aid for probably 2 years now. And that's no surprise to any of you, right? The administrator is of Irish descent. She's very committed to that. We see it as very important. They joined with us last year at UNGA, providing $50 million for malnutrition. They've now signed on to do new additional work in Africa. But it's about saying, how can we have joint goals, joint ways of working, bringing new partners to the table. We brought Korea to the table to work with us on Ukraine agriculture when the president was just here last week. So we're thinking about who are new. We're still working with the UK. We're still working with Germany. But we're also thinking about who's bringing new money to the table. So I'll stop there, but thank you for the question.
So Susan, in your role as a panelist.
Okay, put that hat on.
Michelle mentioned Colombia.
Yeah.
A country you know well. Mm-hmm. And you were involved in USAID's engagement there when it was playing a significant role in what was a national security agenda strategy. So how does this framework, and beyond just the money and operating in a foreign policy, how does that resonate with you, and what was your experience?
Yeah, well, thanks, George. Well, first, congratulations.
And we only have about a few minutes.
Okay,
I know you could go
I'll
on
be
for
very
2
brief.
hours.
I know, because you can talk about Colombia forever. But first, I want to say congratulations and echo what Tony said at the start. We know how hard this is to do a policy framework, and for everybody who worked on this, congratulations. It's so important. It's so important to set that trajectory for the agency And I can say now, pivoting to Colombia, I had the honor of serving there from 2005 to 2009 when we didn't have a policy bureau. And we were developing strategies, and I remember submitting it to Washington and being told, well, we don't have a policy bureau anyway to approve this. There's no real overarching framework. Just keep going. You know, you're on the right path. And I think Colombia is a great example of really what the agency has been doing for some time of, you know, the progress beyond the programs. Programs are important. It is the bread and butter, but it's about the overarching framework and strategy and getting to your point and question that you raised, George, about the geopolitical nature of the work we're doing now, which is truly different than when I was in the agency. Obviously, with the war in Ukraine and with the rise of China, you know, really thinking about this differently. And obviously, there may be a movement towards transactional, as there was with Colombia at times, but we were part of the longer term and really integrated, as the deputy administrator talked about, of development diplomacy. And as Michelle just highlighted, the importance of us being at the table as all development actors to achieve that longer term goal. And so Colombia, it was started under President Clinton, President Pastrana, went several administrations, bipartisan, because there was the larger goal that all of us were working toward. And I think that's the framing of thinking about this moment and what we do, and how do we think about those larger term goals beyond the implementation of the programs, and how do we knit that together and have leadership driving towards that. And the policy framework provides that, so it's an exciting time, I think.
And Sarah, not to preempt what I'm going to ask you about later, but it seems like to me that AID has been trying to play that larger global role on leading other donors and implementers into the localization space, and back in the fall, brought donors together to try to sign on to a statement committing them to localization.
Yeah, exactly. And so, you know, we see the approach to localization as encompassing a number of things that we can do as an agency, but one of the roles that we see being able to play is being able to use, you know, our voice, our convening power, our relationships, our partnerships, to be able to have conversations and to be able to lead conversations about what locally led development can look like throughout sort of the broader ecosystem. And so last fall, Michelle Samilis and her team, including Shireen Faraj, who is here in the audience today, really led an effort in partnership with the aid agency of Norway, NORAD, to pull together a bunch of bilateral donors to sign on to a statement that commits the signatories to really pursuing sort of three things. And one is shifting power as much as possible to those whose lives are affected by the work that we do. The second is to shift funding as directly as possible to the proximate organizations, again, who are living the challenges that we are seeking to support their efforts to address every single day. And then the third is to sort of continue this sort of public advocacy around locally led development. I think as Deputy Administrator Coleman put out at the beginning, and George put out as well, you know, this isn't new. The international community has been talking about locally led development, or country ownership, as it was called, sort of in the era of the Paris Declaration 20 years ago. But there is an opportunity to think about it in new and different ways now, really sort of underscored by this groundswell around diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility, with new thinking about, you know, how can we think about grappling with some of the inequities that have been baked into the aid system for a long time. And because of this, there is renewed attention and different kinds of attention to the role that we as donors can play in terms of thinking about how to shift this system to really be more locally led. And so, again, we had 14 bilateral signatories to this broad donor agreement on locally led development, and are really excited about the signal that that sends in terms of sort of the direction that we see things moving. So,
Great example. Thanks, Sarah. Susan, I'm sure you can seamlessly switch hats now.
Sure. I was thinking about what Sarah was thinking, again, of this not being new, and yet we have a moment now. We really do have, I think, a unique moment in development where we're talking about inclusion, we're talking about decolonization, we're talking about issues. Many of you are members of the Coalition for Racial and Ethnic Equity in Development. More than 100 development organizations have signed on that. The administrator has leaned forward on inclusive development, obviously, as the deputy administrator talked about, with inclusive growth. And yet, as we look at the issues, and it does, and we're so excited, Michelle, that budget and policy are coming together. I mean, again, to reiterate that, because it's wonderful to have policies, but it really does come down to where's the money and how do we drive that forward. And so as we look at that, several questions came in online about inclusive development and, questioning with the policy framework where, whether it's gender and women's empowerment, clearly the administration has made a huge commitment in the FY24 budget of, an 180% increase, but questioning by the community of, is this still ticking the box of integrating it? Okay, we'll count that as gender and women's empowerment. Or obviously youth. As the head of the International Youth Foundation, it's wonderful to have a youth policy, but again, how is that, as well as the disabilities community, the indigenous populations, LGBTQI, all the things that are so important for inclusive development, how do we actually have program dollars? And most importantly, how do we measure impact, right? I mean, Sarah, this is your area, and as well as Michelle's, of being able to show we're actually making a difference as we drive towards the Sustainable Development Goals. Because again, taking it all back to that higher level of why do we do what we do, and not just obviously the US, but all of us as a community, we're not going to achieve or make progress against the Sustainable Development Goals without these communities. And so there was a sense within the policy framework that there was a bit of the ticking the box. Each of the communities have said, okay, how many times was gender mentioned, or youth, and how do we do that in order to drive towards also inclusive growth? And again, I think the community is thrilled that inclusive growth, just as under the Obama administration, broad-based economic growth was a pillar of our policy framework. But how do we make that happen without the money really being directed, and most importantly, measuring impact?
Yeah, this is a great question, and I think that, of course, the Biden-Harris administration, one of their key priorities is inclusion, and so that is something that USAID has really embraced in terms of how we're thinking about what the path forward is. And one of the ways that we're thinking about inclusion is in the institution of new offices to focus on this, both internally and externally. And so one of these new offices, of course, is the Office of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Accessibility, and a new chief DEIA officer, and Nene Diallo, of course. And the mandate of this office in particular is really to advance DEIA across the agency through coordination and through sharing of technical expertise. Thinking about how we can make USAID a more safe, respectful, inclusive kind of environment to work. It has to start with that angle to be able to think about how that applies to our programming. And of course, we also have the Inclusive Development Hub that we've set forth in the Bureau for Development, Democracy, and Innovation in DDI. And this hub is really framed around this understanding of inclusive development as an important angle to all of what we do and when we work. And when we talk about inclusive development, what we're talking about is really this approach that's built on the understanding that sort of all people in all communities with all of their diversity have a role to play in the development process and need to be able to bring all of those voices, that diversity of voices, to play in order to really have sustained results. And I would just highlight, too, that there is a very strong linkage, of course, between inclusive development and localization, right? So localization, in the absence of this inclusive development lens, really risks sort of exacerbating or reinforcing some existing inequities that may exist in the countries in which we work. And of course, inclusive development without some of the tools and approaches and sort of impetus of localization, maybe risks not having, as much of a way to operationalize some of these approaches as well. And so really together, these offices provide some of the sort of, agency infrastructure around some of these issues as well. But I also want to reinforce that inclusive development, gender equity, women's empowerment, these are all aspects of the policy framework and really integrated into the various aspects of the policy framework. It's also captured, these issues are also captured across a suite of policies that really sort of describe and elaborate on our commitment to inclusive development. So we launched our updated gender equality and women's empowerment policy in late March. We are anticipating a new LGBTQI+ policy later this year, which will build on and expand upon the existing LGBT vision for action. We're also updating our disability policy, and we've issued an updated youth and development policy just recently, or just last year. And then we're also, we have our Promoting the Rights of Indigenous Peoples policy, which really promotes sort of this thoughtful engagement on how to engage with Indigenous people. And so we're also providing, in addition to the policy, base, which is important, but in terms of how we bring that into action, what we are doing is providing these new tools and resources to really help enable our mission staff to be able to translate this policy into praxis. And this includes USAID's first guidance on inclusive development, and this will highlight sort of the roles of equity, of intersectionality, of localization as part of our development efforts. And we're also developing an inclusive development toolkit that will really help USAID staff, be able to, again, bring this to the fore. In terms of gender specifically, because this was something that
and measuring impact,
like USAID continues to affirm, right, that gender equity and women's empowerment is vital and important, right? And so the policy really underscores that that there are specific kinds of challenges that women face, that gender diverse individuals might face, that LGBTQI+ individuals face, and specific challenges that are faced by men and boys as well. And so it lays out 7 principles to think about how to think through some of these things. We are also bringing to bear like workforce capacity issues to try to address some of these as well. And within the next 3 years, we are going to ensure that there will be sort of a gender expertise at all of our missions and all of our bureaus across the board, and are also working to strengthen our operational policy, our ADS, if you will, to be able to bring these angles into it as well. But the measuring results piece is also really important, and thinking about the kinds of questions that bring in questions around gender, and how to think about ensuring that we're targeting some of our evaluation questions to look at some of these questions as well.
And I think there will be a lot of interest in the community and how the community can help in framing those questions and how we actually measure impact, because it's fabulous, all the policies and toolkits and guidance you're providing. I know, having been in a mission, you really depend upon those toolkits, but ultimately we all have to be driving towards how are we actually measuring everything we're putting into this is having that impact, and that's, I think, one of the questions.
Susan, when the agency puts out a policy on DEI and makes it a major issue, what is the experience of that policy being picked up by implementers, by partners?
Absolutely. And I'm sure, Michelle, who's dialoguing so much with our partner governments. I was on the phone today with a big British private sector company, and this is exactly what we were talking about. And they were excited to learn about the work that's being done here in the U.S. on advancing DEIA, because they know it's important for this company, which, sorry, I can't reveal. It's a big global partnership IYF is about to launch. And it was so interesting to share the experience of everything we're doing here with them and how we can be one community. So it has an impact, right, Michelle?
It does. This is such an issue that is really dear to my heart, and there are a couple things that I think are just really important that I wanted to pull out of the conversation. One is that in addition to all the new offices that we're establishing, the new policies we're putting in place, we're also doing a ton of work, and a lot of that is being done by our Learning, Evaluation, and Research Office and PPL, on helping our staff, foreign service officers, civil servants, et cetera, to show up at the table differently. We're doing tons of trainings, tons of sensitivity work around how do you moderate a meeting? Where do you sit at a table? What words do you use in those conversations? These seem like small things, but they change the tenor of the conversation. In addition to all that, we're also working on changing how we're evaluating each other and our colleagues in our work and our peers. So we're changing the way foreign service officers are evaluated. We're changing how civil servants are evaluated to make sure that we're taking into account their application of these things. In terms of evidence building, I want to also just flag that we've also just recently created a new Office of the Chief Economist. And our Chief Economist is Dean Carlin from Northwestern. He is fantastic, but he's very focused on working with all of us to say, are we asking the right questions in the right way to make sure that we're measuring the right results? How do we tell our story? How do we make that happen? And then the final thing I also just want to highlight is we're also, as part of our localization effort, really thinking about not just implementing programs through local partners, not just having them weigh in on how we develop strategies and plans and projects, but how we monitor and evaluate those projects. And we just recently signed a new MOU with CGD and Hewlett Foundation to grow and to build the capacity and strengthen local African monitoring and evaluation organizations so that they are actually evaluating our programs and telling us if they're working. Are we asking the right questions? Are we doing it in the right way? So I think we're trying to think outside of your typical box of how to do these things and really apply new ways of working.
How did you create the transition to what I wanted to raise? That was very nicely done. Sarah, localization, which is something you know something about, being the prime lead at AID on that. It was notable, and it's gotten a lot of attention, the administrator's comment last week on the Hill, that localization is difficult. Pretty practical statement, but it's very honest and humbling for the head of the agency to admit that and to acknowledge that. A couple of things that for me have been missing from the conversation is how much power are we willing to transfer? Particularly when transferring that power may conflict with US values, human rights, the conversation we just had about gender and the empowerment of women. And I haven't seen that discussed in the policies and the conversations. Secondly, I haven't seen a consideration of, well, what is the role of the international expertise? What is the role of INGOs and contractors who have decades of experience in development? And the third element that you are very much in the mix of is the definition of what's a local entity. And a lot of controversy as to whether or not local affiliates of US organizations should be included. And what we do, whether or not we include in that definition the several $1 billion a year that we put through international organizations, and how Publish What You Fund has identified that would add several $1 billion to our calculation of what we should be included in localization. So I'm curious as to how you're grappling with these issues. You've been at AID for a year now. You worked on the issue before you got there. Now you're in the midst of it. So give us a little bit of update on those.
Well, George, you really hit the nail on the head in terms of some of these important questions that I think are really core to how we're thinking about localization. And I appreciate your commentary on leadership, but I just want to also acknowledge that leadership for localization really is across the agency as well. So the power question is a really good one, right? And so shifting power is really sort of core to the conceptualization of what it means to advance locally led development. You can shift funding, that's one thing, but that's only part of the story. You have to think about making sure that you are creating space for local actors to really be able to exercise leadership over things like priorities, design, implementation, and defining and measuring what results are. The power shift is really important, right? This is important because of thinking towards sustainability, right? In terms of owning the goals, the processes for what you're trying to do. And it's also important, as I mentioned too, for thinking about this equity lens as well. How do you think about grappling with some of these inequities? The policy foundations that we are putting in place to support localization and underpin these efforts really reflect this goal of shifting power as well. If you look at, for instance, the local capacity strengthening policy, what this clearly reflects is a shift from thinking about donor-identified gaps and trying to address those gaps in capacity to shifting the power to the local organizations with whom we are partnering to try to hear from them where they see opportunities, where their priorities are for capacity strengthening, and seeking to be able to support those as well. It also shows up in our acquisitions and assistance policy and our efforts to do more things like co-creation and co-design to be able to ensure local priorities are really brought into what it is that we're doing, decisions over how, why, and where we invest. But I do want to just comment too, because George, the point you made is a very good one. Like when you talk about local priority, is like like you have to acknowledge that in every country in which we work, priorities, interests, incentives are very heterogeneous, right? And so thinking about that, like we have to make sure that everything that we do can respond to multiple different filters, right? And one of those filters are, does this respond to local priorities, local ideas, local solutions, right? But also, to what extent does this actually comport with, procurement laws, that's one thing, but also be our values as well. And so ensuring that, the projects and the programs that we would put forth are ones that do things like advance democratic processes, continue to advance diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility priorities, work through things like climate change, et cetera. And so I think that that's one sort of, key answer to that, is that there have to be multiple filters to how we think about our work. The second question you asked, George, is about international expertise and the role of that. And the very short answer to that question is that there is a key role for everybody in terms of thinking about how we advance locally led development. International implementing partners have very key roles with their technical expertise that they bring. They have key roles as mentors in capacity strengthening. We talk to local partners quite a bit who talk about the value that they get from their relationships with with international implementers in that case. When you think about local private sector as well, they have strong connections, innovation, et cetera, and relationships there. And of course, international faith-based groups have deep roots and good connections as well. And so the key to this is really just in the relationships, right? How do those relationships exist that create that space for really creating the conditions for local actors to take the lead over some of these kinds of issues? The definition question, George, is a great one, and I want to use this opportunity to thank very much Publish What You Fund, who's put forth some analysis and has done a lot of thought leadership around, different or alternative ways that you might measure what it means to be local. And I just want to underscore, too, that this analysis actually highlights that there is a lot of ways that you could measure what it means to be local. What it means to be local is a very complex, it's an inherently nuanced kind of concept, right? And so any definition that you might choose will sort of inherently come with sort of errors of inclusion or exclusion, sort of depending on where you draw that line. And so what we have put forth in terms of thinking about how we're measuring what it means to be local, it's a proxy for local leadership. And we aim to sort of create this proxy with the understanding that another priority that the agency has is one of burden reduction as well. And so we wanted to be able to, as much as possible, draw data from our existing systems to be able to put forth a suggestive value in terms of what, the amount of funding that we're providing to local organizations. And so I also want to underscore that we have a commitment to transparency through all of this too. And again, thanks to Publish What You Fund for continuing their advocacy for transparency. We are aiming to put forward, we have a commitment to publish our data set of what organizations we are considering local as part of our progress report. And so that those who wish to dive into that data set and apply different filters are absolutely welcome to do so. Thank you.
Michelle, Susan, anything to add? No.
I'd love just to add, it was wonderful to hear, Sarah, that you're reflecting on this isn't new, right? And we were talking beforehand when we created the Policy Planning and Learning Bureau 13 years ago. The previous heads of policy bureaus sent me policy documents from the time of the Kennedy administration. And it was about sustainability. It was about locally led development. And whether it's USAID Forward and Local Solutions or Journey to Self-Reliance. And now it evolves. And I guess my question related to that, you don't need to answer it now, but it's something of how do we ensure it's institutionalized? Because we get so stuck in feeling like we're not making progress. And again, this is a unique moment. And so having consistency in definitions, having consistency in data. So whoever's sitting in these chairs in the future, we're actually we're moving in this direction because I think as we all know, right, they're not waiting for us. It's a very different environment. And again, congratulations to the team for really taking this on in a very bold way. But I think we have a lot of work to do as a community.
Okay. Now put your moderator hat
Okay.
on.
So now, in a consistent way, one of the things that was emphasized in the policy framework and the deputy administrator mentioned was the importance of the private sector. And again, kudos for the private sector engagement, modernize, and all of the work clearly that this administration has been doing, building on previous administrations. And yet, we know agility and speed are absolutely critical to working with the private sector. And at IYF, I have the privilege of working with a lot of companies, and it's not in a transactional way. And so I think it goes back to this larger theme that George put at the start of like, how do we, they're in for the long haul, you know, whether it's Caterpillar, who IYF has partnered with for 20 years, maybe it's 2 to 3 year agreements, or Hilton, more than a decade. And in this case, it's about youth employment. The policy framework talks about the importance of the private sector, but we often think about it as terms of resources, but it's actually the commitment to solve development challenges, whether it's youth employment, climate change, you know, health systems, and, you know, how we actually then think about this in terms of also local private sector. And so we'd love to hear your thoughts on this. And, you know, that there's just, we need the agility to move quickly. And while it's great this administration created the EDGE Fund, it is only $50 million, right? And there's huge potential to really, you know, grow that. And how do we make sure the EDGE Fund, which for those of you who don't know, it's a fund that very quickly, hopefully, they're going to make announcements any day of private sector partnerships, often with international organizations and USAID missions, to dive into an issue. But how do we make sure it's not just the same organizations, and we're really growing the partnership base, which again is a priority for this administration. So your thoughts on some of those questions?
Well, let me say a couple things. One is, this is another issue that we've been trying to do for a long time. Mm-hmm. I think we all remember the Global Development Alliance and the work that's been done there. So I think what I would say is, I think the EDGE Fund is our attempt to try to be agile and nimble within a world where a lot of our funding is earmarked. Mm-hmm. And so what we're trying to do is to say, can we have a small pot of money, $50 million, to demonstrate that we can do this, to demonstrate that it will make a difference, and demonstrate that we can bring new and different partners to the table. As soon as we get our 653A approved by Congress for FY23, we will be able to hopefully make some announcements. But I think it is the first attempt. We are also working within some sectors that have traditionally been working with the private sector, whether it's the agriculture sector or the education sector or the microenterprise sector. We're also having them think differently about how they work. So one of the things that's unique about the private sector modernization effort in this administration is that oftentimes we centralize those that outreach unit, and we say that all has to be done within. I mean, we're doing that with foundations, or we're the hub for foundations in PPL. But the way they have done this with the private sector engagement is that there are contacts for all of these private companies across the agency. And so if you're working with Caterpillar and you're an RFS, you're the main lead for that company. It doesn't have to be in our democracy, development, and innovation private sector team. Yeah, that's important. And so what we're trying to do is institutionalize this across and make everybody have some ownership of it. One of the concerns that you mentioned is really the focus on big corporations. And look, there's always going to be a focus on big corporations, whether it's Bayer going to Ukraine, as she had mentioned, or others. But we're also working with different ways of working. So the Aspen Network worked with young people in Guatemala and has worked with 60 corporations to bring a pot of money together, about $60 million, for them to get seed funding for young small private sector companies in Guatemala. So we're also trying to think about how do we kind of build from the bottom up, which is about the inclusive economic growth model.
So we're a couple of minutes from moving to the audience participation. Before we do that, and because I'm a member of the Center for Sustainable Development, and I've got Tony Pippa sitting here, Michelle, I have to ask you, the Sustainable Development Goals. The framework has a upfront commitment, but then it's not mentioned again in the framework. And unlike all other major donors, the U.S. has not really embraced and brought the SDGs into the policy, into your policies and programs and projects. And what you're doing is in pursuit of a lot of the specific 17 goals, but you're not using that as a frame. And why is that?
So I have some really good talking points here on that given place. So let me say a couple of things. One is that we are very proud to be supporters of the Sustainable Development Goals. The National Security Strategy talks about it, our strategy talks about it, and we are working very carefully with the interagency as we lead up to the SDG Summit in September to really put forward some real commitments around the SDGs. As you said, everything that we do is in those 17 goals. Every project that we have, every policy and strategy we put out has goals and outcomes attached to those. And so it is true. We do not outline in the policy framework, this is about SDG this is about SDG that, but we are very focused on achieving the SDGs, and we're very focused in this policy framework on integrating all of those projects together, whether it's gender, whether it's our New Democracy Delivers project, which says we're all about supporting democratic countries that are trying to make a difference, address corruption, and then in those countries we're going to show that there is the progress has been made, and that the communities can see it by bringing in more health money, more education money. So we are very committed to it, but it is true. It is not integrated here by calling it out by SDG. But I wouldn't read that as us stepping back from it. This policy framework steps very forward into meeting those SDGs. And as someone previously said, we are the biggest provider of ODA. And we're not stepping back from that, and we will continue to apply that in ways that get us towards achieving the SDGs.
Okay, over to you. There's a microphone. Please introduce yourself. Up front, there's a question here up front. Introduce yourself and be brief, and end your comments with a question mark.
Thank you very much. My name is Matthew Murray. I'm a former Commerce, former USAID, and currently teach at Columbia and do USAID project work in Ukraine, in Egypt, and Armenia. So congratulations on this incredibly broad-based and deeply thought-out policy, as well as other leadership initiatives that USAID has shown on anti-corruption and other similar important policy areas. The question that I have goes to, as you look at broad-based, inclusive economic growth that leverages U.S. private sector in different countries, there are at least two challenges, and there are many, but they're the traditional local challenges, but there's also a strategic competition challenge arising from Russia, to some extent from China, pushing a model of capitalism which is antithetical to broad inclusive growth, and that is based in certain ways on oligarchic rules of the game, right? So that's a challenge that you face. The other challenge is actually, in some respects, here at home, because the United States is, as you know, changing the way it approaches free trade generally. It's adopting industrial policies that some of our traditional trade partners are not very happy with at the moment. And so I'm just curious how the economic component of what you're doing addresses those two particular challenges.
Thanks, Matt. Michelle?
Wow, these are hard questions.
That's not an easy question.
That's not an easy question. But so I think that goes back to kind of the theme that we started with, which is the world has changed. And that it is important for us to change and to think differently about the work we're doing. And so what I would say is I think that the Partnership for Growth, PGII, is actually the best example of our new way of working. So under PGII, it's an interagency project where we are thinking about how do we build infrastructure in countries where we're all working, and how do we use the different tools that we have across the interagency. How does DFC go in with certain tools? How do we go in with tools? We probably go in before DFC goes in because we're creating the enabling environment. Then DFC comes in, MCC comes in the countries where they're working. State Department is doing a ton of work to try to bring private sector to the table. And for the first time in my career at USAID, we're working very carefully and closely with commerce to think about how do we really, but what does the private sector need to be able and willing to go into those countries? If our private sector doesn't go in, if we don't go in, then countries like China and Russia, who do have a different model for development, who do have a different way of supporting infrastructure and other investments, will be there. And the issue is also, I mean, the other issue that makes this really hard is that we have to do all of this while maintaining our values as the United States for transparency, for sustainability, for following environmental and social policies that we care about. But we do feel like we're making a difference. We're finding countries are saying, you know, we really do want to create projects with you and not using those other models because they're seeing how things work and don't work. So I would say that PGII is probably our best example of how we're working differently, which is very consistent with both the national security strategy as well as with, you know, driving progress beyond programs and working across the interagency. The final thing I'll say is this is not just a US initiative, it's a G7 effort. It's taken a while to get off the ground as the G7, I will admit that. But in the next G7 Leader Summit, you're going to see real commitments by each of the partners to this initiative and to us working together and to projects that we're working together on.
And Matthew, I'm going to play a dual role like Susan. And the latter part of your question has been something that's troubled me for some time. And that is the conflict between what we know the benefits of open trade is with the growing industrial policy. And I think somewhere down the road, there has to be a new set of rules of the game. And at some point, we've got to bring China into this game. And we've got to set some rules that protect, promote, advance trade and open trade in the context of knowing that governments are going to play a role in favoring particular sectors in their economy. I don't know how that's going to come out. But somebody smarter than I am needs to deal with that issue. Yes, young man up here in the purple shirt.
Thanks so much. Hey, I'm Sam. I'm just a recent college grad, but long admirer of both the work at USAID and Brookings. So I just had a question. You were talking a lot at the beginning of the conversation about the need to center a lot of this policy around promoting, you know, women and girls initiatives there, and I could not agree more. You know, everything from education to, you know, access to menstrual products. But from what I understand, a lot of organizations throughout the world have found it difficult to partner with the U.S. given, you know, with each turnover in party leadership in the executive branch, we've flip-flopped on, you know, the Mexico City policy or like ag rule, and that's made certain organizations on the ground hesitant to work with U.S. funding at all because there's this lack of long-term commitment. So given the sort of flux in U.S. politics and how that can affect our funding and the particular projects we're willing to engage with, how do you instill, you know, you joked about going back to the Kennedy administration, we're sort of stuck in this cycle. So how do you say, all right, we are going to be there in the long term, and these particular projects, which require long-term funding, are going to see continued funding when we know certain administrations are more or less willing to actually feed funding, particularly for you know, the issues of, you know, gender equity that you were discussing.
Susan, do you want to tackle that? Because you've had to deal with that both as aid, but now
Thanks so much.
Susan heads up an organization which is created to partner with local organizations for the long term.
Yeah, and it's so important what you're pointing out. There are changes of administrations, and our partners are extremely savvy, sometimes more savvy than we are about the intricacies, whether it's the Mexico City policy or where we are on locally led development and whatnot. And I think what I learned under serving under 5 administrations, actually, with USAID and now running a nonprofit is it goes back to, I think, what Isabel and Michelle and Sarah have pointed out, and we all feel is this is the largest development agency in the world. You know, it is, and it's been 60 years. And so how do you sustain those relationships even during the tough times? And I really applaud our missions on the ground. The way IYF works, we only have local offices, local teams work through local partners who can really navigate those uncertain times. And we shouldn't take it for granted because, again, getting back to, we're in a different environment now. So they might have been with us in the past and they kind of got it, and And, I did start around the time of the Cold War ending, and that shifted development dramatically. I'm sure there are many people online, my former colleagues, who know how development was during a Cold War period. And I think we have to rethink this. So you're raising an important point that I hope will really take, and we will think about this new environment we're working in, and how do we keep those partnerships? Because it's so important for the long term.
Can I just say one thing? Because I've been a women's health advocate for a very, very long time and working on gender issues off and on over my career. I think a couple things I would say. One is, it is true that every administration, there will be hot button issues. We've all worked on them. We've all seen them happen. They'll raise their heads. But what I've seen through various administrations as well is that USAID and the State Department and many other agencies are full of professionals who figure out how to keep those relationships, as Susan said, going and working in the way they need to. And the last thing I'll just close on is the importance of evidence. And going back to that, we have demonstrated over the years that women are the kind of engine of the world, right? If you give money to women, they're going to spend it on their children, their kids are going to be better educated. I don't have the statistics right on the tip of my tongue, but we all know them. And that evidence is actually what kept a lot of the gender work that we started in the Obama administration and had started in Clinton and other administrations going through the Bush administration. The Bush administration did great things on gender and women's issues. Women were the center of PEPFAR and really were part of that. Even in the Trump administration, they continued to work on gender issues, on women's economic growth issues. Maybe they did it slightly differently than we did, and we might have come in and shifted the different ways of working. But because the evidence is so strong of the importance of women to making economies grow, administration through administration will still continue to work on it. So I would encourage all of us to really think about, how do we keep building evidence out of our programs of the importance of focusing on women?
Good. I forgot to mention earlier that we had about 18 questions submitted with the registration, and Susan and I have folded probably about 6 of those into the questions we've asked. So thank you all for providing that input.
Not doing questions for the record, though.
Oh, yeah. Oh, good ideas. I like that. Have we had any, since we started, any online that you want to bring to the fore?
We have one question along that line of evidence. The policy framework appropriately references the use of experimental methods and cash benchmarking to improve the cost effectiveness of programming. However, a study USAID did in 2020 found that only 10% of USAID evaluations are impact evaluations, and half of USAID impact evaluations don't meet the agency's own definition of an impact evaluation. Only 3% were very high quality. It would seem that to improve cost effectiveness, USAID should do many more impact evaluations. The question is USAID taking any steps to expand the number and quality of impact evaluations with cost analysis?
So I'll take the first. Do you want me to try that, or
I was going to
Sarah?
say, it sounds like a question Sarah would have asked when she was at CGD. But go ahead, start.
I can start, and then Michelle, please, because this is your
you do it.
space.
Did you
so.
plant that question, Sarah? With
I was
one of
going
your-
to say.
That's a great question.
I think I know who did that.
Great data.
Exactly. So of course, so the answer to that, the short answer again, is that yes, USAID is taking a lot of steps to think about how to do more impact evaluations and more cost analysis. So many of you are familiar with the evaluation policy that was instituted in 2011, which really highlighted the importance or the need to do impact evaluations for pilots or for programs that you are testing. And in 2020, we have sort of re-upped that policy and made some additions to it to really emphasize the importance of conducting an impact evaluation when the question that you are trying to answer is about attribution, right, in terms of what USAID contributed to the outcomes that you see. At the same time, we also added new requirements that all impact evaluations should be accompanied with cost analysis to be able to build this data bank, if you will, of sort of the cost effectiveness of different kinds of interventions. So we haven't seen the full effect of these changes yet. And actually, I would just note that the COVID pandemic, of course, led to lockdowns, which really put a damper on some of our evaluations. A number of them were delayed or canceled. And actually, you can see this in the data that we have on our Development Experience Clearinghouse. We've gone from an average of about 150 evaluations per year to only 68 in fiscal year 2021. 2021 and 76 in FY 2022. But I would note that despite this sort of overall declining trend, impact evaluations have stayed steady. And they've actually increased to 24% of the total, and there were 18 of them published in FY 21 and 17 in FY 22. So the commitment to impact evaluations is certainly there and strong. And I know Michelle mentioned earlier too that beyond our own commitment to thinking about impact evaluation, USAID is partnering with the Hewlett Foundation as well as the Center for Global Development in an initiative to think about how can you strengthen local policymakers, in particular in Africa, to think about how to engage with evidence, how to engage with evidence in a stronger and a different kind of way that can help inform policymaking more broadly as well as our own programming. And I would also just note, too, that with the leadership that we have in place at USAID, there is really strong commitment to this, both from Administrator Power to Deputy Administrator Coleman. Of course, the new chief economist, Dean Carlin, has been a leader in this kind of thinking for many years, and Michelle, of course, as the leader of PPL, bringing these efforts forward as well. But what would you add to that?
The only other thing I would add is just I would focus on the fact that Dean Carlin, our new chief economist, is very, very focused on this. And he's been working with us. We're actually looking at the program cycle and new rules to a new way. This is so bureaucratic, but it's the way USAID works, which is that we're putting in new requirements around impact evaluation, and on evidence to make sure that we are doing what you just described. So there will be some new things coming out probably in the next 6 months on this. And then we're also looking at the evaluation policy and thinking about, is there a need to look at it and think about the use of evidence? Not just how we evaluate and how you do it and what it looks like, but then how do we use that evaluation evidence in the budget cycle, in the project design to make sure it's being applied. So some of that will really come out in the next couple months.
Good. Great. Junji, pass right behind you, Sally.
Thank you, George. Thanks, everybody. First of all, congratulations again for getting your policy framework out. I know that's been that's a big lift. Also wanted to just congratulate the administrator also on having a very ambitious goal on localization. We know it's hard. We appreciate her kind of referencing that last week. And we look very much forward to seeing the progress report coming out and appreciate the point that you will make all your data. We promise to look at it. We promise to get back to you on that. So just 2 quick questions on localization. One is that something George alluded to, and that is what we look at as an opportunity to drive more funding to local organizations, and that is looking at that pot of money that is UN money that is projectized. So not the kind of the assessed contributions that we make, but the money that is set aside for technical cooperation and other projects that are country-based. We've heard from some of our MFIN Southern Voices that is a huge opportunity, and we estimate it's about $840+ million a year that could be open to the possibility of being more local. So we just kind of would be interested in your comments on that in terms of being another opportunity. And then second, I'd be really interested to hear on the other donors, the commitment that you got from the 11 or 17 or whatever other donors in terms of they're pushing the localization goal. What's next in that? I mean, USAID has been the leader in terms of setting a pretty tough goal for itself. So what are the other donors doing? What do we think the next steps are for that?
So let me tackle the first one, because Sally, that's a really important point. And I want to just underscore that the point that you made highlights, again, we have a definition of local partner. There's a lot of other ways that you can advance locally led development that is not just tied to that definition that we are using to capture progress towards this target for direct local funding. And again, we're capturing some of these things separately. Like we're capturing government-to-government assistance separately. We're capturing like regional organizations separately, acknowledging that those are also very important as well. But the category that you particularly called out, and George, you did as well, and I apologize for just blazing right through that, is about sort of UN organizations and PIOs, because we do recognize that a lot of those kinds of modalities, and beyond that, it could be things like trust funds managed by the World Bank, et cetera, as well. A lot of these do end up being almost just pass-throughs to local organizations and can be really useful vehicles for empowering local organizations and getting funding to local organizations. The trick for us, though, is that there's a range of the way that these organizations report to USAID and a range of the way that our systems capture these relationships as well. So it's not an easy thing for us to capture right now. That said, we are in exploratory phases right now of how we can capture that better, because the point you made is exactly right, that these, in some cases, can be really important vehicles for advancing locally led development. So.
Thank you. That is a very important focus of ours. And I know for BHA, which your number seems a little low to me, because BHA gives tons of resources to the World Food Program, who then does subsequently sometimes do go to INGOs, but also sometimes to local organizations. So we are also working with them to try to figure out how we can count that and think about that. In terms of the other donors, we're super excited. We got 14 other donors to join with us. And we are now in the process of working through with them what the next steps look like. And so some of the next steps are things like we're working with the OECD DAC. They have a working group on localization, and they're looking at kind of trying to come to a common definition for the DAC members. We're looking at potentially a new metric on localization. We all work towards numbers, right? We've done that since we were little in school in our grades, and as adults, we work towards those numbers. So the DAC is thinking about a new metric on localization. They're also collecting best practices, what works across different organizations and agencies. We're working on sharing with each other our playbooks on localization. Australia has an incredible playbook on working with local organizations, so we're trying to share that information. And then finally, some of the entities that signed on will probably never give 25% of their resources to local partners. It's just not the modalities that they work on. But some countries are doing things like saying, if we give money to our national NGOs in our country, then those NGOs can only keep a portion of those resources in our country. The resources have to flow to the countries where we're working. So we're trying to think about every country will have a different way of playing in this space, but how can we work with them a little differently? We're also working with foundations to get them to make commitments to localization. And so our Hewlett MOU is our first foray into that, where we're working with local monitoring and evaluation organizations, but we're really trying to move this throughout the ecosystem. And I want to just also say one of the differences for localization in this administration from past administrations has been the support we've received from the NGO community, the contracting community, and others. I have scars still, as does Don Steinberg, who worked on this, and Susan does too, from the hearing questions that we received over the years from the concern that this would mean that we wouldn't be funding INGOs or contractors here in Washington. It is an ecosystem. Everyone will continue to be funded. It just, the shift, there'll be power shifts, money shifts. So I just want to say thank you to the community that has been so thoughtful. You've put a lot of pressure on us, and we appreciate that to be also to reach as high as we can.
Okay, we're approaching the witching hour, so we need to wrap up. Everybody gets a minute to conclude. I'm going to start with you, Susan.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And what is your takeaway? And also, what are you grappling with that the community needs to be grappling with, and that the agency or we here at Brookings or whoever?
Yeah, I think one of the things I'm grappling with so the takeaway is this is a big step forward, and again, kudos to everyone who worked on it. But what I think many of us are grappling with, everything we talked about today requires people. And if we're going to achieve, localization, MFAN, the Modernizing Foreign Assistance Network, long time push for how do we have enough people at USAID in order to deliver on more effective development or innovation, right? We just had FIGDA launch last week, Unlocked Aid, big group part of this. All this comes down to people. And I guess we can't do questions, but I just would sit this with something Michelle testified to, is we need a new way of thinking about this. So she put out there, maybe 15% of all program funding actually is used for people who can actually help advance this. Because if you're going to do innovation, locally led development, a development that really requires more people in USAID, more resources. And George and I have the numbers. We'll put it out in a blog. It'll tempt you. What you'll see what the people within USAID are managing. And as the program resources have come up, people are managing more and more challenges within the agency. And we've got to fix this because, just to end it, coming back to where we started, we're in a whole new world right now. And our development architecture has not kept up with the challenges that we need to meet today.
I can't resist picking up on that. In the last 10 years, AID's program money has doubled.
Yep.
And its staffing money has barely gone up at all.
Exactly.
And you're asking AID people to do more and more and more without adding to their staffing or their training. And I think beyond, 15% of program money being allocated to staffing, which, Michelle, you suggested on the Hill a few weeks ago, I think the agency appropriators need to get rid of the OE account, like most government agencies. And beyond that, I think the agency really needs to engage somebody like the National Academy of Public Administrations to rethink the whole personnel system in the 21st century. Minor project. Sarah, what are your thoughts?
So thank you, and I will frame my thoughts just around localization, just because that's the focus that I bring to my work primarily. And I think the first thing that I would just note too is just like sort of the clear sort of cross-cutting nature of a lot of these things. Like when we think about localization, it's not an initiative, right? It's a how we work, and it's sort of a how we do all of these other pieces that we're trying to bring forth, both in the policy framework as well as just the broader work that we do. And the other thing I noticed as part of our conversation today is that there was a number of different times when we talked about why this is a different moment, right? So I was talking about how the focus on power is different. Michelle talked about the consensus, the new kind of consensus and support for localization that we see now as well. But I also just want to highlight that this is a different moment for this too, because of we have a rich base of lessons learned now. We've been doing this for some time. So we have lessons from prior leadership. We have lessons from our staff who have been doing this for a long time. We have lessons from our implementing partner community. We have lessons from advocates as well. And so I just want to say that this is a process, and we are open and willing and very eager to continue to learn those lessons as we move this forward. Localization is not a short-term endeavor. It is something that we are pushing forward over the long term as well.
Great.
So I have a couple things I'm grappling with. First of all, climate change. We have not talked a lot here about climate change. It is one of our core priorities. And with the new World Bank president just approved today, it'll be one of his priorities. But I think that a lot of the progress we've made over the years is being whittled away by climate change. And so how do we, development has often seen climate change as something over there, and it's really important that we really integrate climate change. And the administrator often says that we're a climate agency. So we're trying to really, as we think about integration, how do we own that and feel that? The second thing I'm grappling with is what you talked about, which is there's a whole section of the policy framework, and I actually have a printed one, which is kind of new in this world, about what we're doing to strengthen the agency. And people is very important. We have a global development partnership initiative, which the administrator launched. We have hired more people. I think we've hired 400 new people since 2022. So we're working really hard. We're focusing those hirings in areas like contractors and climate change experts and DEIA, those areas that are new and that are different. So I would also just say that we also have are focused on our Foreign Service national staff, which is a huge portion of our staff that does not turn over every 3 years as our Foreign Service officers do. And it is a big part of our DEIA initiative, our localization initiative. So those are other issues that we're grappling with. And I'll just close by saying thank you to George, to Susan, to Tony, to everybody who commented on the policy framework when it was circulated. We have an Excel spreadsheet with every comment and how we addressed every single one. But I just want to close by saying, please continue to engage with us. We are happy to come to small groups, to large groups. We want to grapple with these issues. We want reports to come out that challenge us, as published what you funded. But that's what this is all about, because we want to get better. So thank you for having us. Thanks for the hard questions, and please continue to engage.
Well, I wish we had another hour, because there are some important questions I wanted to pose. I really wanted to grapple with the burden reduction effort, which I think is so important to the staffing issue. So the staffing has time to do what they should be doing. And there are other issues. I think, threaded through here was the theme, which I don't think we're adequately grappling with, sort of a dual theme. Matthew raised the issue of how should we be moving in an international climate and framework which is changing and is challenging the traditional thought of how public policy supports enterprise, free enterprise, private sector, and how we make the case for development in a frame that's being dominated by geopolitical concerns, particularly at a time when there's such political divide in this country. And I don't think any of us are adequately dealing with that issue, and we need to address it. And my thanks to you all for coming today, for everybody online. Susan, Sarah, Michelle, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you, George. Thank you.